They told you that evil wears horns, that corruption lives in palaces or hides behind thrones. They lied. Evil wears your family's smile. It eats dinner at your table, laughs at your jokes, and waits, patiently, for you to sleep. The night I found the safe empty, I didn't just lose money, I lost illusion. The metal was still cold beneath my fingertips, smooth and silent, like it had never been touched. No scratches, no forced lock, no sound of intrusion. Only absence, a hollow where everything I had built had vanished. But absence is a kind of signature, and I knew whose hand had written it. You see, betrayal doesn't begin with theft, it begins with permission. The quiet surrender we offer when we believe blood is bond and trust is unbreakable. I had let the serpent into my home, mistaking its scales for loyalty. I gave him the code to my vault, and in doing so, I gave him my name. A week later, he drove home in silver, an Audi, gleaming, new, like a trophy to his cleverness, a monument to my blindness. That's when I remembered something my grandfather once said. Gold doesn't change men, it reveals them. And what it revealed in him was older than greed. It was the same hunger that built empires, burned temples, and sold brothers for silver. I didn't just see a man celebrating stolen wealth. I saw the reflection of every ancient traitor, from the priests who sold secrets to the kings who betrayed gods. A lineage of deceit, dressed in modern clothes. Most people would call the police. But I'd seen too much of the world's machinery to trust the law. The law protects wealth, not justice. It defends ownership, not truth, so I became something else, not a victim. Not even a father, but a historian. Chronicling corruption's oldest ritual, one act of betrayal at a time. They thought they had stolen from me. But in that silence, standing before the empty safe, I realized something chilling. They had merely awakened what I had buried long ago, the part of me that remembers the oldest rule of power: never let the serpent think it's the master. For 3 nights after the discovery, I barely slept. I'd walk through the house long after midnight, every footstep echoing like the tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The walls felt thinner now, the air heavier. From the guest wing, I could hear their laughter. Light, careless, newly confident. That's the sound of guilt before it knows it's been seen. I started studying them the way I once studied markets, patterns, anomalies, sudden shifts in behavior. Lula had stopped asking about the police report. Seth's eyes never stayed still. He was always checking his phone, his wristwatch, the windows. When I spoke to him, he smiled too quickly. I didn't accuse. I didn't even hint. I played the part of the aging father trying to stay calm, the man who believes things will work out. It's easy to fool those who think they've already fooled you. By day 3, I knew more than the detectives would ever find. The dealership visit, the mortgage application, the new house in Scottsdale, every document, every receipt, every digital footprint, they all told the same story, theft disguised as luck. But this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. They'd taken from me because they believed I was harmless, predictable, done. That was their mistake. So I built my plan the way a chess player sets his board, quietly, piece by piece. First I gathered data, phone records, banking traces, online listings. Then I tested their confidence. I invited Lula to dinner, smiled as she told me about their new house, and congratulated her like any proud father would. She never noticed how closely I watched her eyes when she spoke about money. People confess through details. When she left, I wrote everything down, every word, every hesitation, every deflection. I treated her story like an equation waiting for balance. By dawn, I had the first outline of Reverend Eng. Not rage, not destruction, but correction. They thought they'd stolen a future. I'd make sure the cost of that future would consume them piece by piece, because justice, when done properly, doesn't shout. It whispers, it waits, and when it finally speaks, it sounds a lot like truth. I started where the obvious ends, around the edges of their story and the small, careless things people leave behind when they believe they've washed their hands of consequence. The Audi's glove compartment yielded a receipt from a bar downtown, a valet ticket stub, a greasy napkin stamped with a phone number. Little things, little lies. I collected them like a man gathering kindling, alone. One scrap warms nothing, but stacked and careful, they burn a house down. Seth told stories that didn't add up. He claimed overtime, bonuses, a sudden raise, numbers that never matched the rhythm of his pay stubs. Lula told me they'd saved for months, then slotted the same story into a different scene. We sold some old furniture. They forgot I'd cataloged every item in that house a year ago. There was no sale. You'd be surprised how often liars recycle lines, how they think repetition will smooth the seams. It does not. So I worked in shadow. I began to monitor more than paper. I watched movement. Who visits, who calls, where money changes hands in ways banks don't like to notice. I asked casual questions at the hardware store. Did they buy any tools? At the florist, large bouquet purchased for an unfamiliar name. I cultivated a network of mundane witnesses. The neighbor who watered a plant while they were working late. The delivery driver who signed for a box at the guest wing door. Everything human has a trail. If you're willing to look, layer by layer, their confidence thinned. People who steal often think courage is a cloak. They wear it only in daylight. At night they fold. They tell the wrong person too much. The wrong person is anyone who remembers how to ask a simple, awkward question: where did the money come from? When asked, their composure frays like old rope. I learned to ask with mildness, like a friend repeating a misheard word. The mildness was a net. I also learned the cruel arithmetic of trust. Every betrayal inflates to accommodate the taker's illusions. Seth's bragging, Lula's flippant contempt for details, those were not signs of victory, but of a house of cards wobbling. Confidence is loud, guilt is quieter and more interesting. Guilt leaves fingerprints on the way someone rearranges the furniture of their speech. It reveals itself in pauses, in the way a man says of course when there is nothing to be of course about. By the time I had a thin spool of evidence, receipts, a neighbor's recollection, a dealer's offhand comment about cash down payments, I didn't march to the police. I marshaled my patience. I knew the true power in this kind of operation wasn't in exposing, but in letting the exposed reveal themselves. Let them live inside the lie long enough, and it will make a mistake. Let them believe they're untouchable, and they will. It was a slow, quiet hunger that settled over me. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but correction. The world, I decided, would be rebalanced in ways that left no applause. Only a new account ledger, accurately reconciled. The first crack came from pride, not stupidity. Seth bragged. He'd done so to a man in a bar who liked to brag back. And that man, one drink too many later, mentioned a house on Pinnacle Peak with new curtains and a moving truck. The information was ordinary. It arrived by accident, the way truth often does. Unplanned, inconvenient, and brutally precise. I took the tip like a surgeon taking a scalpel, precise and without tremor. I began to map their days in a new geometry, not just who was home at noon, but who left the guest wing door unlocked, which calendar alerts lit up their phones at 2 a.m, when the credit card glowed with purchases that didn't fit claimed income. We're taught to measure time in years, months, and pay cycles. I started measuring in discrepancy, each mismatch a beat in a counter rhythm that would become their undoing. Then I tested them. I let the rumor of an anonymous offer leak, an offhand mention to Lula that a friend had seen someone trying to sell jewelry nearby. Her face didn't twitch. She smiled as if dismissing a stray cat. Seth laughed it off. That reaction was instructive. Genuine panic shatters the mask quickly. Practiced guilt rehearses calm until the stage slips. I also prepared my own theater. I installed a second, quiet lock on a small closet, one no one knew about. I placed there duplicates of important documents, things a thief might overlook but a man seeking to launder guilt would value, a false envelope of transferred assets, a decoy ledger with small, believable entry errors. In private, I began to plant seeds of doubt into their narrative, subtle suggestions whispered in casual conversation. You shouldn't carry so much cash, or banks really flag unusual down payments. I planted the thought that someone was watching, their ledger. Their world tightened. People who build futures on stolen horizons forget that paranoia is an expensive currency. It devours confidence. The first night after my seed, Seth paced the driveway until dawn. The next morning, Lula checked the guest wing door 3 times before leaving. They became clumsy. Their stories grew sloppy, their alibis thinner. Each misstep lit another notch on the timeline I kept. Meanwhile, I pushed outward, consulting the forensic accountant and a real estate attorney under the pretext of protecting my own interests. Neither suspected the private cruelty of my purpose. Their professional detachment gifted me tools, how mortgage down payments are documented, how banks ask awkward questions, where to find irregular cash reporting. I learned to read financial handwriting like most men read weather, forecasts of coming storms. There's an art to watching a person implode. It is deliberate, patient, and profoundly lonely. You must be present enough to catch the first tremor, invisible enough to let them think they are safe. That loneliness becomes its own language. I embraced it. In the hollow it made, I composed my plan in precise, clinical strokes. This was not spectacle, it was arithmetic. The ledger would balance. They would pay in the smallest, most inevitable currency, consequence. Their arrogance was useful. It gave me openings that ordinary suspicion never finds. Seth called an old friend to boast about his investment, and that friend, who had a background in construction and occasionally handled cash, offered to pick up some furnishings. He later texted me a photo of a moving truck with a license plate number. Ordinary, small, and perfectly traceable. I used that plate to buy a history of where the truck had been rented before. History, not narrative, is where people fall apart. I also listened for contradictions in their affection. Lula's kisses were mechanical, her concern rehearsed. People who live inside a lie often keep love in tidy boxes, outward theatrical displays and inward calculations. When she clasped my hand at dinner and said, "We'll help you," I noted the angle of her fingers, the way her thumb pressed, the back of my hand as if testing whether I was still warm. A minute, meaningless gesture, except it told me she could fake tenderness. She had, in short, become skilled at performance. That skill made her dangerous but also predictable. I started to poke at their predictability with microaggressions disguised as elderly eccentricities. A misplaced key left on the counter where only Seth would see it. A question about a friend who found jewelry at a pawn shop. A passing remark that banking rules are so strict now. Each small prod was designed to elicit error, like poking a wasp nest until one gets impatient. They would sting themselves. There is. Another thing people rarely consider: guilt corrodes alliances. Two thieves who believed they shared victory began to look at one another differently. As co-conspirators, yes, but also as vectors of risk. I watched that suspicion grow like mold in damp places, slow, ugly, and inevitable. Once you introduce anxiety into a compact of shared deceit, you're no longer dealing with two people collaborating. You have two prisoners negotiating escape routes. They turn on each other. It is a magnificent, terrible spectacle. My plan advanced in bureaucratic increments. I filed a complaint with the mortgage clinic about a suspicious down payment, not accusing anyone by name but prompting a review. I sent a cryptic email to the dealership's finance department asking about cash disclosures. I planted a rumor with the local bank manager about a potential fraud alert on accounts linked to the guest wing. Each bureaucratic pebble rolled down the hill, nudging larger processes into motion. They felt secure because the police had grown bored. Professionals tire quickly. Corruption is saturated with plausible deniability. But institutions, if nudged, can become allies, slow but relentless. I was patient enough to use their pace. Their systems take time to awaken, but when they do, they move with a heavy, undeniable force. I let that force do the work I, in my age, might not have been able to execute by hand. And somewhere between the paperwork and the whispers, something softer shifted in me. The ancient, sweet rush of righteous calculation filled places anger never could. This was not merely about reclaiming money. It was about teaching a lesson that would carry weight longer than any criminal sentence. I had the ledger. I had the evidence. Now I needed the collapse. One evening, as rain skittered against the study window like nervous fingers, I sat with a folder of collected proofs and a cup of coffee gone cold. The house felt like a theater set, everything in place for a performance that would suddenly be interrupted. The ledger of my life, documents, notes, timelines, sat in a neat stack, each page a small accusation. I had rehearsed my moves, but the rehearsal stopped me from making mistakes. In a way, preparation was my shield. I called an old acquaintance in collections under the pretense of needing to verify a debt. He owed favors, small and lingering, the kind men trade for years of polite courtesies. His response was immediate. "You want me to check a man's credit?" he asked. "Not a problem, 200. I paid. He gave me a file, credit inquiries, a recent wiring detour, a pattern of cash withdrawals structured to avoid reportable thresholds. The image was unmistakable. Human beings do not create patterns of evasion without direction. Someone very near had taught Seth the language of avoidance. I also bribed a cleaner at the dealership, a girl who wanted rent money. She told me how cash is often smuggled in under the table, folded into envelopes, and handed directly to finance managers who liked a little extra. She described, without knowing she described me, how men who arrive with leather shoes and quick hands believe they have purchased silence. Her words were vulgar and brilliant. They gave texture to the receipts and the photographs in my folder. At home, I planted a lie in a conversation so sweet it tasted like a trap. I let Lula overhear me talking on the phone about moving out. about closing the house and taking a smaller life. I wanted her to believe I was retreating, that the missing money had finally humbled me. People who steal feed on apparent weakness. They take liberties with those they think defeated. She rewarded me by letting her guard down, and that slack revealed more. An unsent email on the family computer. A screenshot of a wire transfer confirmation labeled in her handwriting. The handwriting was careless. It matched a note I had found in the glove compartment. At the same time, I began to seed doubt into their net. Orc. I asked neighbors casually if they'd noticed any strangers. I texted the man who fixed the Audi's bumper and hinted at concern about stolen parts. Each benign inquiry lit small fires of suspicion. It's remarkable how quickly a community will notice when money moves in odd directions. People always talk. But the crucial moment arrived not from community gossip or bureaucratic wheels, but from their own impatience. Seth decided to celebrate and drive downtown with a friend to show off his car. He misjudged a turn and scraped a curb. The bumper sustained damage that required parts and, crucially, repair invoices. The shop ordered a new sensor that required serial numbers and warranties. The repair created a record the cash couldn't erase. Each physical injury to the car left a trail in the dealer's system, and every trail opens a corridor to truth. When the paperwork arrived, in my hand, an itemized list of parts and cash paid, I felt neither triumph nor cruelty. I felt only the satisfaction of arithmetic corrected, evidence aligning with motive, with opportunity, with means. It was not the end, but it was the moment the story shifted from suspicion to plausible accusation. The world, in its bureaucratic slowness, had begun to catch up to the human deception I'd been mapping. With a tangible paper trail emerging, the dynamic changed. Confidence is brittle, evidence is not. I began to craft the narrative that would present the facts in a way ordinary men understand, ledger balanced, anomaly highlighted, conclusion drawn. When a man sees his life reduced to receipts and dates, the armor of bravado peels away regardless of how well he once hid it. I made sure my case would read cleanly to people who do not love drama. I organized the receipts chronologically, annotated them with times and places, and cross-referenced them with phone logs and witness statements. I tied the $25,000 down payment to the dealership receipt, the $45,000 house payment to the mortgage application, and the remaining withdrawals to cash movements captured in ATM cameras and neighborhood surveillance. Paper is dumb and faithful. It cannot perform for sympathy. It merely states. The problem with thieves is they assume secrets are private by virtue of being told to only one person. They forget that every secret has a geography. They leave footprints in that geography. The night Seth scraped his car, a neighbor across the street recorded the sound on a doorbell camera. I acquired that clip. In it, you see Seth step out of the car, curse, and then open the glove compartment to take something out. His hands are quick, his face is not careful. The clip didn't show the theft, but it showed movement and intent. Intent matters in phrases people care about. It tilts the narrative from accident into suspicion. I also started to work the human angles. I contacted a woman at the bank who processed the mortgage application under the guise of being concerned about fraud. She was cooperative and blunt. If someone is trying to hide an illegal source of funds, she said, they'll try to structure deposits and freeze accounts quickly. We can flag it. I did not ask her to take action. I merely asked for information. She told me the down payment looked unusual and that the application had been rushed. Those words were small but heavy. At home, things grew uncomfortable for them. I began bringing up the missing funds in gentle ways that made it hard to react without exposing oneself. At dinner, I'd tell a story about a client who lost trust and how long it takes to rebuild. I'd compliment Seth's new car in a way that sounded like admiration but tasted like measurement. It's astonishing how often people who steal try to bask in the warmth of the life they bought. They forget that warmth casts shadows, and the shadows began to deepen. Lula started checking phone logs, not because she had reason to, but because she was now a prisoner of her own conscience. Set. H's late nights turned into nervous mornings. They both started to talk less to each other. Isolation works in favor of truth. It cracks the conversation and leaves space for confession or error. By now I had enough to make a case that couldn't comfortably be dismissed as coincidence. The police, while reluctant, had to take a second look when a bank flagged the mortgage as suspicious and a dealership confirmed the unusually large cash down payment. The machinery had been nudged. It creaked, and then slowly it began to turn. Halfway through the plan, when the machinery of systems and shame had started to mesh, I decided to harness the one force the internet still respects: ritualized engagement. It was practical and psychological. Rituals solidify identity, and identity, once voiced, locks people into behavior. I needed them to commit, to speak, to reveal what their words meant. So I did something unconventional. I recorded a short, intentional moment, an evening thank you to guest wing helpers and neighbors, framed as a casual note on social media that said very little and revealed even less. But the comment thread is a public ledger as well, and I watched as small community murmurs became a chorus of detail. They wrote, they guessed, they speculated. One neighbor mentioned a man who'd been hauling boxes at odd hours. Another remembered an envelope handed to a valet. Then I addressed the camera directly because there is power in speaking and in asking others to speak. If you believe in truth, I said, type the phrase "I remember the ledger" twice. Write it once for the witness in you and write it again for the witness in the system. The phrase is meaningless to strangers, but binding to those who live by accounts. I wanted public affirmation, 2 simple repetitions to act like a small viral contract. It would ripple into comments, and the ripple would whisper in human ears that someone noticed. You should know this. Asking viewers to repeat a phrase twice is not manipulation so much as ritual. Ritual demands accountability. It transforms passive viewers into active witnesses. When someone writes the same phrase twice in public, they expend credibility. They mark themselves as participant rather than bystander. For people like Seth and Lula who depend on quiet, that little act is dangerous. It signals eyes in the crowd. The trick worked. Comments flowed. Some repeated the phrase twice without context. Others asked, puzzled. A few brought up local observations. Most importantly, the act of public repetition created a pressure that invited error. People who are guilty hunger for control over narratives. They respond to perceived threats with moves that betray them, deleted messages, hurried transfers, calls to obscure accounts. The public ritual nudged them to act, and action begets paper trails. After the comment ritual, I watched their behavior very closely. Seth began to call his friend who helped with the truck more often, and Lula started to answer messages with clipped tone. Where there had been bravado, there was now calculation. They no longer celebrated in public, they hid. Hiding requires coordination, and coordination requires communication. Communication leaves traces. If you rewatching this know why I told you to do that tiny thing, the small repetitions of public action matter. They create a net of witnesses. They make the invisible visible, if only in the small language of comments and timestamps. That net would not convict them, but it would make them clumsy, nervous, and eventually honest in the ways that matter most, through paperwork and panic. That slackening of composure produced mistakes like a steady drip produces erosion. The first major mistake was small, a transferred amount to a personal account flagged down by the bank's compliance software. Automated systems are unsentimental. They report anomalies. The transfer was labeled as personal loan repayment and originated from a friend of Seth's with a thin history of small, cash-only transactions. It was sloppy and, crucially, it connected the dotted line between a series of withdrawals and a specific account under review. When I learned of this transfer, I felt a kind of stern satisfaction. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I documented. I printed the notice, cross-referenced the transfer times with CCTV footage at the ATM, and annotated the discrepancies in the ledger. Men who build their lives on expedience cannot measure patience. I could. Patience, I'd found, bends the future to the man who understands time. Meanwhile, the human drama intensified. Lula started to sleep during the day, Seth's jaw clenched in photographs. Friends texting them grew fewer. Pride is a lonely companion, especially when its foundations are fraud. They began to look like people rehearsing a defense, not a life. That posture is exhausting. It erodes spontaneity, and when spontaneity is gone, mistakes multiply. I escalated in one direction, the social. I quietly met with neighbors, recounting without accusation the sequence of odd events. "Did you notice the moving van last week?" I'd ask. "Did you see a young man leave the house late at night?" Small questions. People oblige with stories. Curiosity is a social currency. It buys facts. As more stories aggregated, I had a chorus of small witnesses who, when added together, sang louder than the private rehearsals of the guilty. On the legal side, I pressed quietly but firmly. I gave copies of the organized evidence to the attorney I'd consulted, asking for advice on civil remedies, reclaiming funds, freezing transfers, a structured restitution plan that would tie the new assets, car, house, back to the theft. Criminal prosecution is a blunt blade, civil law provides a scalpel. I plan to use both the mechanical and the humane instruments available to a man with a ledger and a lifetime's patience. Seth made another error born of desperation. He attempted to sell a piece of jewelry, an item nearly identical to one from my late wife's collection, at a pawn shop. The man behind the counter, more honest than most, recognized the make and called me. That call felt like lightning, raw, bright, and revealing. I asked for the item to be held and told him to call the police, but I also knew the practical limits of criminal action. Instead, I photographed the piece, created a chain of custody document, and added it to my file. Their false universe was cracking. Each misstep, each transfer, each pawned trinket, each hurried email was a tremor. Together they constituted an earthquake we could not ignore. I kept adding these tremors into the ledger, annotating with date, witness, and probable motive. I presented the attorney with a dossier. He nodded. This can be used, he said, to pursue civil seizure. Civil mechanisms, I knew, could be crueler than prison for men who count on visible wealth. You lose what you display. That is the lesson I intended for them to learn. The pattern now had gravity. It attracted official attention, not because I asked for it, though I had pushed gently, but because the data itself demanded scrutiny. The detective who'd once sighed at my case returned, this time with a clerk from financial crimes in tow. They came with the procedural thickness of institutions, folders, forms, a practiced skepticism that has slowly become respect when faced with careful documentation. We met at the precinct. I laid out the ledger like a quiet accusation. I watched their faces change as the evidence accumulated. Receipts connected to mortgage down payments, dealer invoices, ATM withdrawal timestamps, pawn shop holds. Facts are blunt instruments. They don't conspire. They merely exist. And when you pile enough of them on a table, the table begins to suggest a story. The detective asked questions I'd already answered in my notes, timelines, names, distances. And then he asked the one question no cunning evader can fully mitigate, motive. I told him simply greed and convenience. The fact that your own family sees you as an asset is a type of violence. It's a crime that begins in entitlement and ends in erasure. He wrote this down, not as philosophy, but as rationale for further inquiry. As the legal side activated, I turned back to social pressure. I began to make small, public references to the property on Pinnacle Peak, anecdotes about a neighbor's renovation, a passing remark about a moving truck driver who couldn't produce rental records. Nothing direct. The point wasn't to accuse openly, but to make the social space around them prick with curiosity. A community that notices becomes a social tribunal of sorts. Shame, when public, is a powerful engine. Seth and Lula reacted predictably. They rushed to patch their social image, photos of family dinners bright on social feeds, cheerful captions, a fabricated normality. But digital life conserves mistakes, timestamps, metadata, inconsistencies. I archived their public persona alongside the private evidence in my folder. Both are instructive. Together they form an anatomy of deceit, what people present and what they actually do. The attorney proposed a strategy, a civil suit to freeze assets, a motion for temporary restraining orders against property transfers, and the use of subpoena power to compel testimony for dubious transfers. It was aggressive and precise. The law, when properly applied, can be a machine for unraveling secrets. Also, it moves slowly enough to avoid hysteria and fast enough to prevent deliberate disappearance. We filed. Not publicly at first. Procedural motions, confidential requests. When subpoenas go out, the first tangible panic in a thief's face is telling. You begin to see the color drain as they calculate. Can we move money before the court acts? Can we transfer property titles through intermediaries? Panic invites mistakes. And mistakes, at this stage, are effectively confessions. The subpoenas were the first hammer. They arrived like quiet thunder at Seth's workplace and Lula's phone. Workplaces are fragile ecosystems. Suddenly being the subject of legal interest makes even casual coworkers suspicious. Seth called in sick. Lula deleted comments and messages in a flurry that read like the hand of a man trying to erase prints from a window. In their panic, they did two predictable things. They tried to hide assets and they tried to explain away behavior. I watched both moves with a cold clarity. Hiding assets often means placing them in the hands of others, friends, shell accounts, or under-the-table safekeeping. These third parties are leverage points. You can focus on them, make them uneasy, and watch how they crumble. Explanations, meanwhile, are rehearsed. Scripts meant to flatten suspicion, they fail in the presence of paper. Then an unexpected ally appeared. Seth's friend, the man who'd helped move boxes, stumbled into regret. He called me one night after a few drinks and confessed more than he meant to. He'd been paid in cash, given envelopes, told to help without questions. He described a night when Seth delivered a box to a storage unit and left hastily. From that small confession, I obtained a storage facility address and a unit number. Keeping secrets requires so many small collaborators. Persuading one to break is often enough. I rented surveillance on that unit under the pretext of verifying a contractor's storage. The facility was lax, security cameras with grainy footage, an attendant on late shifts who cared little. But through patience, you can coax clear things from grainy footage, the shape of boxes, the timing of entries, hand movements that suggest hurried concealment. We captured a clip of Seth depositing a box with a jewelry case inside, a full chain of custody piece of theater I had not expected but fully exploited. The storage evidence was the turning point. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the tangible presence of stolen property. Possessi. On is the language of ownership. And when you have a box with a known object, the locket of my late wife, the hallmark of a broken set, the law has a language of its own. It moves from suspicion to recovery. The storage gave us grounds to petition the court for a search warrant, and when the judge read our affidavit, he wrote the word probable next to the neat list of evidence. That is a small word with enormous power. The raid was quiet and clinical. Officers moved with purpose but without spectacle. The box was unremarkable, and yet when the locket emerged, its engraving, the faint scratch only I would know, the air in the room condensed. The officer who handed it to me did not speak. Words are small in the presence of objects that close narratives. The locket was proof, and also a moral instrument. It demonstrated intention and ownership in a way a ledger could not. After the raid, the social fabric around them frayed faster. Neighbors who once smiled now avoided their gaze. The storage, once an innocuous place, became a theater of exposure. Seth and Lula no longer had the convenient excuse of, "We're building a life." They had to explain a box full of evidence, and explanations when confronting objects sound thin. The raid changed everything. Possession is visceral. When you hold the object that once belonged to someone you loved, the past becomes a present instrument. I felt the weight of the locket in my palm like a verdict. The law had returned what was mine, but the purpose of recovery was not merely restitution. It was transformation. I wanted them to understand the cost of their choices in a way that paperwork never quite communicates. With the physical evidence in hand, the attorney accelerated civil actions. Temporary restraining orders froze certain accounts and placed liens on the property. The bank that had once smiled at a large down payment now sulked under compliance pressure. They discovered their mortgage was not invulnerable, it was an agreement subject to verification. The house they thought secure now sat under a legal cloud. I had no desire to destroy lives beyond repair, only to recalibrate the moral ledger to reflect reality. Seth and Lula reacted with the kind of raw panic that makes people scramble. Seth tried to transfer a small portion of the funds through a friend S account. Lula attempted to claim an inheritance that did not exist. Both moves were clumsy. The friend's account flagged. The inheritance claim was easily disproved with simple records. They were out of practice at lying. The machinery of law now amplified the consequences of their improvisation. There is an uglier movement that dishonest people make. They try to rewrite the story by attacking the storyteller. I anticipated that. They attempted to paint me as a bitter father clinging to control, an older man embarrassed by circumstance. I let the accusations float. Reputation is resilient to slander when you have evidence, and the evidence in this case was stubborn. The community that once indulged polite conjecture shifted to careful listening. People are slow to believe evil, but once shown, they are often willing to align with the visible truth. I did not relish their humiliation. Cruelty cheapens justice. My objective was corrective, to make them bear responsibility proportional to their theft. The civil suit sought restitution for the missing funds and ordered an accounting of all assets acquired in the suspect period. We asked for a trust to be created to hold proceeds until a thorough audit was complete. The court, seeing the chain of evidence and the obvious connection between sudden wealth and the theft, agreed to temporary measures. They began to plead, not with remorse but with practical bargaining, promises to repay, offers of small concessions that barely skimmed the surface. I refused most. Token gestures are the currency of evasion. True accountability is difficult and often ruinous. That is the hard truth I want them to confront. If you steal someone's future, you must pay with the future you have seized. The legal pressure produced juried panic and a strategic scramble. They sought shelter in plausible deniability, claiming loans from relatives, sudden sales, and debts that seemed to explain their cash flow. But the ledger is meticulous. It does not forgive improvisation. Each claim required documentation and verification, and where documents were weak, stories fell apart. During this phase, I observed something fundamental about people who depend on theft as a foundation. Their moral imagination atrophies. They cannot envision restitution unless it reflects a direct benefit to them. So when I proposed a structured repayment through assets, they balked. The concept of returning wealth without emotional payment was foreign. Theft, in their world, is a transaction to be justified, not an act requiring atonement. I also leveraged social exposure in a controlled way. A local columnist with a nose for small-town tragedies agreed to cover the rise and fall arc in a measured piece focused on accountability rather than sensationalism. The article was careful, factual, and included quotes from neighbors and legal filings. Public light is a disinfectant. It forces the community to reckon. People are less willing to host or help those under public scrutiny. Invitations diminish, favors evaporate, and the social circle tightens into an isolation that mirrors culpability. At home, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The guest wing, once a space of laughter and borrowed comfort, became a warren of whispered calculations. They fought, not about money, but about who would take the fall. The petty cruelty of their squabbles revealed more than I needed to know. They no longer trusted each other. In that distrust, I found something like mercy. A shared crime requires shared trust. Without it, conspirators fracture. I continued to press legally. Subpoenas reached third parties, accounting for transfers, and forced testimony loosened more than a few tongues. A friend confessed to accepting envelopes but claimed duress. Another admitted to being paid to hold items. The web of small collaborators began to unravel as each person negotiated their exposure. Fear is contagious in the underworld of petty conspiracies. Finally, the most practical step, I initiated mediation with a stern proposal. Full restitution, asset liquidation under court supervision, and a binding repayment schedule. The goal was reclamation, not ruin. Courts prefer settlement. It is faster and less costly. The settlement I proposed would have ensured their utter discomfort for years, but would also have repaired the financial hole they'd created. They resisted at first. Legal reality has an efficiency all its own. It converts fear into signatures. At last, when signatures came, they arrived thin and tired. The settlement was not generous, it was proportionate. It ensured that the car would be returned or sold and that the mortgage would be restructured to compensate the loss I had endured. The agreement included penalties for late payments and strict oversight. It was precise, legal, and, most important, visible. Visibility is a kind of morality. Public obligations shrink opportunities for private theft. When they signed, Lula's hands shook. She did not look at me. Seth's jaw was set, an old stubbornness trying to pretend a dignity. The law did what law does, it trades moral ambiguity for enforceable terms. I stood where years of experience had trained me to stand, calm, methodical, and relentless. In the silence after the signing, I felt neither triumph nor pity. I felt the steady restoration of order. But legal victory is not the same as restoration of relationship. You cannot reconstruct trust with affidavits. The family, once whole by complacency, would never be the same. That was unavoidable. Sometimes justice is necessarily a wound. The choice is whether the wound is an ending or a lesson. I had insisted on lesson. They had learned at cost. After the settlement, they moved out. The silver Audi left the driveway, the house relinquished a tenant. They believed, perhaps, they could start over elsewhere. Start over, yes, but not without the memory of consequence. Humans bear histories on their bodies and bank accounts. I had added a ledger to their memory. In the quiet that followed, neighbors returned to normal. The community conversation softened into polite distance. People regained their smiles. I began to repair my home in small ways, new locks, a fresh paint, shelves for the items returned. The locket sat on a shelf where I could take it down and remember, not to savor but to anchor. Memory is a tool and a teacher. I used it to remind myself why meticulous, patient justice matters. I did not gloat. I did not seek their ruin. I sought balance. The outcome was imperfect, human, and contained. It demonstrated a truth I'd known for decades. systems, legal, communal, and moral, can be marshaled to correct private thefts if one is willing to be patient, methodical, and unafraid to wield them. Years will pass and small towns will forget the details of our story. They will remember, if anything, a cautionary tale: do not take what is not yours, and never assume family creates impunity. My ledger still sits in the safe, documents, annotated receipts, and the small trinkets returned. I keep them not as trophies, but as tools. Tools teach. They prevent complacency. There is a final lesson beyond law and ledger. The human cost is not only financial. Trust erodes like cliff face in constant rain. Rebuilding is not about replacing what was stolen, but about teaching the survivors, myself included, how to discern generosity from entitlement, love from calculation. I learned to close doors where doors should be closed. I learned to watch for the small rehearsals of deceit, the offhandedness that hides accumulation, the sudden confidence that smells like theft. To the men watching this, who hunger for truth and mastery over chaos, understand that power without ethics is brittle. A man can build a life of comfort and still be hollow. Wealth reveals character, it does not make it. If you find yourself holding advantage, guard your character more than your assets. If you are betrayed, remember that force is tempting, but slow, quiet justice, patient, precise, and proportional, teaches more and lasts longer. I never wanted to be a judge. I became one out of necessity. The world gives us tools, laws, neighbors, systems, and sometimes you must use them to restore balance. Use them with a clean hand. Be intentional, be surgical. Never mistake the satisfaction of revenge for the architecture of lasting correction. And know this: in the slow work of reconciliation, there is dignity. I returned what I could to repair my life, and let the rest be weight that teaches. They will live with their choices. I will live with mine. We all continue, altered by the ledger. That is the real currency of consequence, the way we change because of what we have done and what has been done to us. If this story taught you anything, let it be a simple one. Never confuse family comfort with immunity. Guard what matters, measure what matters, and when necessary, use patience as your sharpest tool. The world rewards patience. It rewards precision. It rewards a man who will not be hurried in the pursuit of truth.